Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Well, it didn't take long. Days after the Putin-Biden summit, the UK committed some very undiplomatic acts in the Black Sea. We'll tell you why. Also, after heated debate, the EU has proven unable to find a unified voice to engage Russia. Whose fault is that? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by my guest, Marcus Papadopoulos in London. He's a historian, analyst, and author of the new book, Arise Rossiya, The Return of Russia to World Politics. And in Budapest, we cross to George Samueli. He is a podcaster at The Gaggle, which can be found on YouTube, Rumble, and Locals. All right, gentlemen, Crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Okay, let's go to London first. Marcus, can you explain to me what the UK is doing in the Black Sea and all of their gobbledygook explanations for their intrusion on territorial waters of Russia that Russia claims? Now, I know that the UK does not recognize Crimea as part of Ukraine, but they as far as Russia, but you know they have two different explanations. It's Ukrainian waters, it's international waters. What is it, and what are they doing? And it's very undiplomatic. Are they looking for a provocation? Go ahead, Marcus.
Well, the infamous incident in Russian maritime waters adjacent to the Crimean Peninsula was evidently a staged provocation by both Britain and America. And I say America as well, because London and Washington act in unison on the international stage. And that is especially the case when it comes to Russia. And this staged provocation was both foolhardy and exceedingly dangerous. Now, the question is, why did London and Washington orchestrate this provocation of Russia? Well, I cannot believe that the Americans and the British seriously wish to goad Russia into a military confrontation with the West, because the Americans and the British know, as we know, that a military conflict with Russia would rapidly escalate into a nuclear exchange. So it is my opinion that the reason why the British and the Americans staged this provocation was to portray Russia as an aggressive and dangerous force, which warrants the increase in NATO's presence on the Russian border in terms of soldiery and weaponry, and also it warrants the case for Ukraine to be admitted into the ranks of NATO. The British government's official line that they do not recognize the Crimea as part of Russia, and therefore HMS Defender, the Royal Navy ship involved in the incident, was in Ukrainian waters, is an illogical and quite simply untenable argument to make. Because if that argument was applied across the world, then other countries in the world could no longer recognize British jurisdiction over the North or Northern Ireland, or British jurisdiction over the Malvinas or the Falkland Islands, or indeed British jurisdiction over the Chagos Islands. So the real reason was to goad Russia, to portray Russia in a very negative, dangerous way, to justify NATO's increasing and dangerous presence on the Russian border, and also to increase the case for Ukraine to be admitted into NATO.
You know, George, we all know that I guess it's annual Sea Breeze exercises are planned for this week here. Was this a trial balloon to see what the reaction is going to be? Also, we have with this a British ship getting so close to a Russian sovereign border on the Crimea in the Black Sea, is that it was a reconnaissance mission as well, seeing what kind of defenses are there. So, I mean, there's provocation written all over this. Go ahead, George.
Yes, there was a provocation, and without question, it is about trying to first humiliate Russia and to mobilize NATO into more expenditure, more reasons for existence, more expansion. but I think also there is a domestic aspect to it, which is that, I mean, the Boris Johnson government is in hopeless tatters. I mean, we have its Minister Matt Hancock resigning this weekend over an absurd situation where he was violating his own COVID restrictions. We have Johnson touting his supposedly global Britain, whereby Britain now has a major world power and has a role to play in the world. Well, of course, it is complete nonsense, because Britain is not a serious player on the world stage. And what Britain did in promoting Russia was clearly absolutely ludicrous, just on its face, because of the rationales that it has come up with, such as, this was innocent passage, when it was, even when you look at it, just in terms of what the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea says, an innocent passage does not apply to a warship that is passing through territorial waters, locked and loaded, and is engaged in a propaganda exercise. And Johnson openly said this was a propaganda exercise to show that these waters don't belong to Russia, but belong to Ukraine. So it was a propaganda exercise. And moreover, Russia had already explicitly stated in April of this year that there is to be no innocent passage in Crimea. That's it. They stated it in April. So this was months before Johnson comes along with this nonsense that, this was innocent passage. We were just going from A to B. So going back to your original question, I think Britain is trying to throw its weight around in the world, but is making itself up into an absolute laughingstock. And unfortunately, because Britain doesn't have a proper opposition, I mean, where is the Labour Party? There's no one really holding Johnson's feet to the fire as to why exactly is he getting Britain involved potentially into a very serious military conflict with a nuclear power.
And Marcus, at the end of the day, I mean, it was an attempt to humiliate Russia, but it was the UK that was humiliated. I mean, this was a self-inflicted wound. I mean, they turned around and ran away. Okay, and of course, in the media coverage of it, Russia, there was a warning shot. There were planes involved, and as far as I understand, the UK government denied all of it, but none of that is true. It actually all happened. Go ahead, Marcus.
Peter, first of all, I must say this. I beseech people to not dismiss Britain in the world, who is at the heart, along with the Americans, of the banking, of the global banking system and the global financial system. Britain, in particular, specifically the City of London. Britain is an exceptionally powerful global player in the world. Do not base power just on military strength.
I think if I could interpret George's words, and he can jump in obviously too. I mean, the UK is making itself relevant diplomatically, militarily on the coattails of the United States, which I want to talk about a little bit later here. I think that's the context here. Yes. I mean, no one's dismissing the City of London, okay? Yes. But I mean, of course, to use your own words, they never would have done this if the Americans hadn't agreed.
Yes, absolutely. The Americans provide the military muscle.
Hey, George, we'll get you. Go ahead.
Yes. I mean, indeed, the Americans provide the military muscle, but of course, traditionally, Britain is at the heart of the global financial and banking system. Now, as regards to NATO, well, I believe, Peter, that NATO expansion into Eastern Europe has come to a halt. Perhaps NATO will expand into Southeastern Europe, specifically Serbia and Bosnia. But as regards Eastern Europe, it has come to an end. Why do I say that? Because the Kremlin will use all means at its disposal, and I mean all means at its disposal, to ensure that Ukraine is never admitted into the ranks of NATO. But I believe that HMS Defender being deployed into Russian maritime waters does show that the British and the Americans feel emboldened, because Britain never recognized the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania as part of the Soviet Union. Yet nonetheless, London never violated Soviet maritime waters adjacent to the Baltic states. And let me add this one other point, Peter. The British ruling elite, instead of deploying the Royal Navy to the Black Sea to goad Russia, should actually deploy the Royal Navy in full strength to the English Channel to defend England from illegal immigrants crossing on a daily basis from Calais. If they care about the British people, that is where they would deploy the Royal Navy to.
Well, along on this program, I've said NATO really does have an important mission. Only one single one: defend Europe. And immigration is one of it. Anti-terrorism is another. But those are way down on the list, apparently. George, you want to jump in? Go ahead.
Yes, no, I don't disagree with Marcus about the key role of British finance in the world. But as a military power, Britain is insignificant. I mean, we've seen how feebly Britain has fought in recent years. I mean, its military performance in Iraq was a joke. So any attempt by Britain in Ukraine or in the Black Sea to get itself into some sort of a military conflict with Russia would end in a complete debacle for Britain. I mean, and that's, I think, very different from the United States. I mean, the United States is a serious military force. Great Britain is not a serious military force. And that's why I think Johnson's idea that Great Britain is this global Britain is some sort of a major power in the world is completely misconceived.
Okay, we're rapidly running time with this part of the program. I want to ask you both the same question. First, to Marcus here. You can interpret the recent Putin-Biden summit in many different ways, and George and I have done it on a different venue, our gaggle. But I mean, is this undermining any possibility of kind of lowering tensions? Because that's one interpretation you can take from the summit. Marcus first, then I'll go to George. Go ahead, real quick.
No, I don't believe that. If there is to be an improvement in relations between Russia and the West, then the ball, so to speak, is firm in the court of the West. The West, NATO needs to withdraw its presence from the Russian border. The Americans need to pledge in writing that Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia will not be admitted into the ranks of NATO. And also the Americans need to dismantle their missile defense system in Poland and Romania. Unless that happens, there will be no improvement in relations between the West and Russia.
Your answer, George, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I don't think there's any real prospect of improvement in relations with Russia unless NATO makes significant changes. NATO will not make significant changes. But I think there are countries such as Great Britain that thrive on tension with Russia. It elevates their significance, and suddenly you can play around being the sort of the big player on the world stage. So Johnson certainly does not want any kind of a détente, because then his role in the world is much diminished.
Well, a détente, it's not a moneymaker, is it, gentlemen? It's not. All right, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on some important new news. Stay with our team. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. This is the home edition. To remind you, we're discussing some real news. Okay, gentlemen, let's change gears. Let me go back to George in Budapest. Well, there's this trope out there that the Russians are always trying to divide member states of the EU, conquer and divide and all that. But when the EU gets together and on the back of a strong suggestion from the German Chancellor and the French President to start a dialogue on specific issues with Russia, they put it to the vote, and you know what happened. No consensus here. The Russians are left. Who do we talk to? You want to talk? Who do we talk to? And that's that's where we stand right now. How do you see that, George? Because it looks like the Germans and the French want to move forward, but of course it's the Poles and the Baltic states that do not want to. Actually want more sanctions. I mean, this is just turning the EU's policy towards Russia into a pretzel. Go ahead, George.
Yes. Well, it's the Poland and the Baltic states, but it's also Josep Borrell, the EU foreign minister, so to speak. Remember, he was tasked by the EU Council to come up with a working paper as to future EU relations with Russia, precisely because France, Germany, probably Italy, want a working relationship with Russia. And then Borrell comes up with this ridiculous paper about a week, 10 days ago, in which he talks about constraint and push back and engage with Russia, engage only on issues that matter to the EU, not on anything that might matter to Russia. So that's Borrell, who seems to be completely stuck in this mindset of Russia is this malevolent force. So, you got what is really going on in the EU. The serious powers in the EU, which is France, Germany, and Italy, say we have to return to what was the status quo ante before 2014, a working partnership with Russia. And then you've got the EU bureaucracy in the name of Borrell, and then you've got the Baltics and Poland, who just want more sanctions. And the end result is, well, we're going to have more sanctions. And that's what the EU's position now is. We're going to be working towards developing more sanctions. No one quite knows about what, but rest assured, more sanctions are needed.
Marcus, I'm glad that George brought up 2014 because that's, of course, on the back of the illegal forced regime change in Ukraine, which for some reason is blamed on Russia. And so we have this, going on 7 years now. Why should the Russians really particularly care? I mean, if you don't want to sit down and talk, I mean, why should they keep waiting around? I mean, this has been my position for a long time. If you don't want to parlay, then get on with your life. We'll get on with ours. We live in the same neighborhood, but if you don't want to be good neighborly, then what's the point? Why should Russia have to reach out? The ball is in Europe's court, okay? And they need that relationship with Russia. Russia needs a relationship with Europe less and less with every passing day. That's my contention, at least. Go ahead, Marcus.
Prior to EU expansion into the Baltic states, into Eastern Europe and into Southeastern Europe, the EU truly was a force to be reckoned with. It was an exceptionally affluent elite club whose members, with the exception of Greece and Portugal, made an immense amount of money. However, the EU's leadership overstretched themselves when they admitted the Baltic states, Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe into the ranks of the EU. They never considered what the potential consequences could be for having countries such as Poland and the Baltic states inside of the EU. And now, today, we see a farcical situation in which a minority of members of the EU are holding to ransom the rest of the EU vis-a-vis Russia. The EU, and I mean specifically the major countries, France, Germany, but also Italy and Spain, and then others such as Hungary and Greece, want to have better relations with Russia. In fact, they want to go back to how relations were prior to the coup in Kiev in February of 2014. But the European Union is handicapped. It is handicapped because of the behavior of Poland and the Baltic states. And I don't see how Paris and Berlin can actually get around that now, because yes, the French and the Germans have very strong financial relations with Russia, but so also do Spain and Italy. In particular, the agricultural sectors in Spain and Italy are no longer able to export their produce to the Russian Federation as they once were prior to the EU sanctions on Russia. So the EU, or the leadership of the EU, only has itself to blame by having expanded into parts of Europe which were always going to be problematic. They did not strategically plan for countries such as Poland and the Baltic states. And now, as I said moments ago, the EU, in regard to its relationship with Russia, has become handicapped because Poland and the Baltic states do not wish there to be any improvement between the EU and Russia. Why? Because they are constantly portraying Russia as a threat to the whole of Europe, and thereby they are receiving even more financial assistance from America and also even more soldiery and weaponry of NATO on their respective territories.
Yeah, so, George, so obviously the EU isn't making any headway here. I mean, what are the benefits that countries like Poland and the Baltic republics garner from this position? Because I simply don't see any. It's just kind of spite, and they want to spite for historical, cultural, ideological reasons. The entire bloc suffers. And as I say, every time I do crosstalk, the world is moving on. Europe, if you want to tread water, go right ahead because everybody else is moving forward. I mean, this is just the most ridiculous situation to have. It's like dealing with children in a cafeteria. Go ahead, George.
Yes, it is. Their calculation is, well, we will have Washington in our corner. The United States will be there for us. Right. But we know about the United States. The United States doesn't shell out money unless there's something really big in it for the United States. And I mean, you remember when Trump said, okay, well, we're going to move troops out of Germany and move them into Poland. And then they said, oh, great, we'll call it Fort Trump and everything. But it never materialized. I mean, as always happens with these American promises, they never really materialize. And it's true, as Marcus said, which is that there was a moment in history when the EU was a kind of a serious third force. You had the hawkish, very Russophobic United States, and then you had the EU, which had good relations with America, but also sought a partnership with Russia. And much of the sort of the Brexiteer energy in the UK came from anguished political figures that said, oh my God, this EU that we're members of, it's going to become anti-American and it's going to become neutralist and it's going to be pro-Russian. We can't be a part of this because we have to maintain this transatlantic alliance. But of course, it hasn't happened. And then this EU now is in this ludicrous position. It's like even more hawkish, if anything, than the United States.
Yeah, and it's very interesting since Brexit here, we have obviously the UK out, and now they've gone. It's almost kind of like the UK is kind of the I can't find the right term. And like America's help around the world. We discussed in the first part of the program going into the Black Sea, maybe doing it for the Americans, showing their value, okay? Because their influence, obviously, over the EU, at least diplomatically, is non-existent anymore. So, I mean, and now we have a small number of countries within the EU dictating the direction of it, and I would say that the UK's role is more symbolic than anything else. I mean, the symbolism is really humiliating every step of the way here, and then you have paralysis in Europe. So again, I repeat my position. Why should the Russians particularly care? If what they need to do is counter NATO. The rest of it is an internal, pan-European problem. Go ahead, Marcus.
What is lamentable, Peter, is when Britain finally withdrew from the European Union, there was, and perhaps there still is, a minuscule window of opportunity for an improvement between the European Union and Russia. Because whilst Britain was in the EU, countries such as France and Germany would come under more and more pressure indirectly from America via Britain. However, we have seen no improvement in relations between the EU and Russia. Indeed, I would go as far to say that relations have deteriorated even further so far in 2021. And we have to ask the question, why? Well, I think to a very large extent, it comes down to the immense influence that Washington exerts inside of the European Union, not just economic, but also militarily. Why? Because most of the European Union member states are also crucially members of NATO. And if countries are members of NATO, then that provides America with a tremendous amount of influence over the decision-making process in those respective countries, but also in a bloc, and I'm talking about the European Union as a whole. So I believe that whilst Paris and Berlin sincerely want to have dialogue with Russia, sincerely want to be able to trade properly with Russia, again, they are hamstrung by the very fact that they are both members of NATO and because they are not able to eliminate American influence inside of the European Union.
Let's finish off with torture. I mean, remember during Trump, Trump was disregarding or disrespecting allies. But actually what we have under Biden, which is a continuation of other administrations, the more melees inside the European Union, the better. Okay, I mean, what a way to treat your allies. Okay, where they have a form of paralysis. They can't even make their own foreign policy. And of course, I agree with Marcus. It works to Washington's advantage. Your great allies, they're in paralysis. What a bizarre way of looking at the world. Finish up for us, George.
Yes, that's right. And remember, Trump's line was, "Oh my God, we're doing all this for Europe, and they're such ungrateful people. They don't realize all the wonderful things that we're doing for them, and they're stabbing us in the back." And then when Macron suggested, well, maybe there should be a European security and defense identity. What? Are you out of your mind? No, there is only one path forward: security and defense, NATO. And this has always been the American thing.
All right, George, I'm sorry I have to jump in here. We've run out of time. I want to thank my guests in London and in Budapest. I want to thank our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. Remember, cross that rules.